On March 12, 2011, I boarded a flight at John F. Kennedy Airport that stopped in Atlanta, where I was to meet the other members of my tour group before we all boarded a flight to Brasilia, Brazil, to see John of God. It was a group of about 25 people arriving from all parts of the U.S. and Canada. They were all above the age of 45, and all of them were women except for the 3 men in their 60s. I was the odd man out. I was to later learn that all of the men in my group were there to support their wives, and I was the only male visiting exclusively for a healing. The tour leader gave us some necklaces to wear and then went over some of the rules. During our days visiting the casa, we needed to wear all white, including shoes, underwear, etc. If we had a spiritual surgery, which was almost inevitable, we needed to follow a special diet and take specially prepared pills that were infused with energy and made from a harmless passion flower plant. Some of these rules seemed strange and almost cultish, and others seemed third world, like the fact that we couldn't flush toilet paper down the toilet, and instead needed to put it in a wastebasket in our bathrooms. There was limited phone and internet service, and we were told that this was a good thing to enable us to disconnect from the life that had undoubtedly contributed to any illness or issues. I had no idea what to expect. I knew I would follow all the protocols, but I didn't fixate on them. Some in the group did, and were concerned that they would screw it up, or ruin their healing experience. The group leaders tried to reassure everyone that everything was happening in divine order, and that the minor miracle of simply coming to Brazil would unfold into a larger one. After the 10-hour plane flight, we landed in the Brasilia airport as the rays of the rising sun filtered through the clouds. I fell in with my group of pilgrims in the main arrival area of the airport. After we had all gathered our luggage, a handful of shuttle vans picked us up to take us for the hour-and-a-half ride to the town of Abajana. The shuttle ride gave us all more time to get acquainted, share stories of healing, philosophies, etc. Many in our group readily revealed their purpose of visiting the casa, while a handful kept the secret. Almost all the women in the group had some form of cancer, and a few were in stage 4 development. They admitted that their doctors had given up on them and told them to get their effects in order. There was nothing more that could be done. Yet these women bravely laughed that they were going to defy the odds with their visit to Brazil. One thing the tour leaders did require was for us to each meet with them in a private counseling session before our group dinner that night. The purpose was twofold: to help us focus on our healing intentions, and to write a note that would be walked through the line and read by an interpreter as we met John of God. I sat down with our tour leaders and they asked me why I had come to Brazil. To be completely healed of Lyme disease, I said, and I expected our little session would end right there, and that they would give me some further instructions regarding our group meeting with John of God the next day. Instead, one of them looked up from her writing and said, "And what else?" I laughed and said, "What do I get, 3 wishes?" But my laugh caught in my throat when I saw the serious looks on the counselors' faces. "Why stop at 3?" smiled the other tour leader. I loved this way of thinking, and it immediately changed my attitude. I had seen videos of the powerful healing miracles John of God was bringing about, and I also knew that not everyone needed visible and physical healing. Why limit the possibilities here? I rattled off a few things but focused on one wish in particular. I'm a musician, so I like to heal people with the music I write and perform. And so it was done. The leaders handed me my note, gave me a few instructions about what would happen the next day, and sent me on my way. I slept well that night, and had to drag myself out of bed after giving an unintelligible yelp that I had heard the wake-up knock on my door, and I would meet the rest of the group in the hotel lobby. Everyone in our group was neatly dressed in all white, including our tour leaders, and everyone had a smile on their face, belying nervous tension. Our leaders gathered us outside the hotel, and there was a cool mist in the streets that spanned to the hillsides and the surrounding areas of the town. We were instructed to walk quietly, meditatively, and to stick together. One person in the group blurted out, "This is it! Our lives are about to change!" A few people laughed, and our tour leaders smiled and then began to lead us down the narrow streets to the casa. As we walked silently, the only sound was of shuffling feet, flip-flops, and a few whispers from the people in our group. A few stray dogs joined us for a while, and we were asked not to encourage them to follow us all the way to the casa. As we made it to the gates of the casa, the hair on the backs of my forearms and calves began to stand involuntarily at attention. There was some serious energy here, and it was palpable. When we entered the main hall of the casa, there were already several hundred people there. It seemed a cross-section of the world's sick. People from all walks of life and all corners of the globe were represented. Children in wheelchairs, a few profoundly deformed people, several with newly dressed wounds, many Brazilians, some of whom wore black or dark colors, and who stood out amongst the sea of white clothing, nervously awaited instructions. Hundreds sat in the main seating area, while some stood, and others crowded around a dais that was punctuated on its back wall with a large wooden triangle. Several people lined up to put photos and messages in this triangle, and then placed their hands on it and rested their heads in the center while meditating or praying for a short time. The room was buzzing with all kinds of energy, and we were asked to remain quiet. A few guides took the stage to rattle off several instructions over a microphone in various languages, while others gave testimonials. As the room filled to brimming, it became a bit suffocating from the early morning heat and closeness of bodies. Suddenly, John of God entered the stage area from a door on the back wall next to the triangle. An assistant handed him a microphone, and he looked a bit weary and slightly disheveled. He was wearing all white as well, and he began speaking in Portuguese. I was later told that he gave his patented speech of, "I've been doing this for 50 years. No one has been able to disprove what is happening here. I'm not the one who heals. God heals." At the end of his speech, his body went rigid and he dropped the microphone. He seemed to have experienced an electrical jolt, and then began blinking and looking around as if entering the room for the first time. His countenance changed, and the women in my group who were closest to him noticed his eye color changed from brown to blue. I noticed that his entire body and head seemed to swell up, and he became almost imposing to behold. Within an instant, an attendant was by his side handing him a scalpel, while others held trays with bandages, alcohol, and other surgical supplies. A few patients were lined up on the back wall by the triangle, and he went to a woman who was standing as if in a trance with her eyes closed. He gently lifted her shirt and made an incision in her abdomen, and only a single drop of blood coursed down to stain her white clothing. She neither opened her eyes nor flinched. I was standing less than 9 feet away, and began filming the event on my smartphone. Several others did the same thing, and people crushed near the stage to witness. At one point, I began to feel lightheaded, like I might pass out, not because of the operation, but because of some kind of energetic disturbance in the room. To my surprise, one of the assistants who had been holding a metal tray with a bottle of rubbing alcohol on it fell to the ground, spilling the alcohol, which immediately filled the room with vapor. Attendants found a wheelchair and quickly positioned him on it, and wheeled him off the stage into an infirmary area nearby. A few others in the audience passed out as well, and they were taken to the infirmary. Toward the end of the surgery, John of God seemed to sense that there was a doctor in the audience, and he regained the microphone to ask that any doctors come to the stage to witness what he was doing. A man emerged who I remembered being on my flight to Brasilia, and he introduced himself as a doctor who practiced in New Jersey. The assistants asked him to describe to the crowd over the microphone what he was seeing. Dumbfounded, the man told us in English that he was looking at a woman who was barely bleeding, but had been cut fairly deep with a scalpel. To his knowledge, the woman was not under anesthesia, and he had not witnessed the scalpel being sterilized beforehand. The woman was being stitched up like doctors had been doing for hundreds of years, and this doctor was at a loss to explain how all of this was taking place. John of God did 2 other surgeries after this. He had one woman sit in a wheelchair on stage, cover one of her eyes with her hand, and he scraped the cornea of her other eye with a scalpel while she sat silently, unflinching. A male patient experienced John of God driving 8-inch forceps deep into his nasal cavity, and then removing some tissue forcibly. It was all rather chaotic and sensational to watch all of this firsthand. I had seen videos of these surgeries on the internet, but to witness them in person, just a few feet away, was a much more intense experience. The energy in the room was another thing altogether. I felt like electricity filled the air and that waves of energy were moving over us. After all the surgery patients had been taken to the infirmary, John of God retreated through the same door he had entered, and then thousands began to queue up for invisible surgery. I was among them, and I took my place in the first-time line. Members of my tour group were herded together toward the front of the line, and we waited while attendants led small groups of us through a door in single file to the back of the casa. Past this next door is where the current rooms were. Earlier in the morning, hundreds of people had either been instructed by John of God or had volunteered to sit in these rooms and meditate for 4 to 6 hours without interruption. The purpose of these rooms didn't sink in with me until much later, but from what I understand, they serve a dual purpose. They allow meditators to be healed by spirits present in the casa, but they also become an engine room of sorts to the casa itself. The high-frequency energy generated by hundreds of meditators is used to help John of God maintain a spirit within his physical body for several hours at a time. It was a strange place to be for the first time. Our group and several thousand others behind us stood quietly in a single-file line that was positioned a foot or two away from people meditating in these current rooms in church pew-type seats. I was so overwhelmed by all of this that I wasn't thinking about my own healing at all. We were led to stand in front of John of God at a fairly brisk pace. Just before reaching him, one of our tour leaders came to me and asked me quietly to produce the handwritten note she had jotted down in our session the night before. I felt nervous, and I didn't feel an overwhelming sense of love or healing, as others had described on the internet. I was hastily led to stand in front of John of God, and I was supposed to take his hand. I didn't even have a chance. He uttered some words to my tour leader, and she pulled me away quickly so that someone behind me could stand in my place. She leaned in my ear and said, "He said for you to sit in his current." And she led me to another area to the right of John of God that had a few more pews where people were already sitting and meditating. I sat down quickly, not having had any time to figure out what was happening to me. I sat there numbly, feeling as if I had done something wrong. John of God hadn't even looked at or touched me when I'd stood in front of him. I'd flown all the way to Brazil for this? What if I never got another chance to stand in front of him? Now what? I sat back, relaxed, and began to meditate more deeply. I felt a palpable wave of heat and energy pass through the top of my head, and I began to think of my family. And I felt my heart open up. I started sobbing. The tears felt more out of joy, gratitude, and release than anything else. I felt as if a burden had been lifted from my heart. I had an overwhelming sense that we as humans were all being well taken care of. Everything was going to be all right. Love is the most powerful force in the universe, and it is being pointed at us at every moment. We just need to take the time to open ourselves up to it. I gave thanks to John of God for being a facilitator in this piece of knowledge, and to the magnificent events he was bringing about every day. It was mind-boggling what was taking place here. Healing was happening on a biblical level, and I got a strong feeling that there were hundreds of spirits and beings on the other side of the veil who were there to take care of us.